Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Time for another revision session. This one is on a case study, Typhoon Haiyan. So I thought for this one I'd be a bit more visual and show you on the screen what I'm going through, some notes that I've made. Hopefully you can revise this, watch it multiple times. I think a really good way of revising this is using flashcards. They really do help me remember my case studies. And this one is obviously for a tropical storm. Therefore, it's for natural hazards. It's a natural hazard event. So we're going to cover the effects and responses of the Typhoon Haiyan. As you can see here in my little diagram in the middle, what I've done is I've circled what the Philippines looks like. That right there, that blue dotted line you can see, is the path of the storm, the path the storm took over a course of a couple of days. And you can see the Philippines is made up of lots of small different islands. This makes it more vulnerable. That's very easy to remember in terms of them being vulnerable because they are an NEE anyway. But ultimately, this is the path the storm took. And you can see if it travels over some small islands, it means the storm doesn't die as quickly. It means that the islands are going to be hit a lot stronger from this tropical storm. So it's a Category 5 hurricane. I've highlighted that down there. Category 5 hurricane. This means it is the strongest type of hurricane. Now, how we rank these tropical storms, cyclones, hurricanes, and even this typhoon here is Category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Basically, it's the speed of the wind which determines how much of a category they get. So anything greater than 155 miles an hour winds means it's Category 5 hurricane, or in this case typhoon. And therefore what you'll see in a minute, as it says down here, 195, therefore it's a Category 5 tropical storm. I've also circled this bit here in the middle, if you can see, 4:40 a.m. Why is that important? Well, ultimately, it happened in 2013, 8th of November, the day after my birthday, but it happened at 4:40 a.m. Now, that is important for context because don't forget, most people are asleep around about this time. This means they are more vulnerable to tropical storms because they're less expecting them. They may be asleep. They may sleep through it. They're not prepared to run or evacuate very quickly if they're asleep. So therefore, this is one of the reasons why it was so dangerous. A bit of context for you. So in terms of primary effects, obviously the winds battered homes, people were made homeless. You can read through these at your own discretion and pause the video if you'd like to. Electric was damaged, the airport was badly damaged, roads were blocked by fallen trees and other debris. Excuse me. They also experienced, I can highlight this here, they experienced a 5-meter storm surge. Now a storm surge is basically a big wave that comes as a result of a tropical storm pushing the ocean water onto land. Now 5 meters is very high. It's higher than most houses. It's about 2.5 times me. Now this means that houses are going to be destroyed. This means that the flooding is going to happen in a wider amount of places, and therefore the effects are worse. And there's also 400 millimeters of rainfall, flooding an area of up to 1 kilometer. If you read that here, an area of 1 kilometer inland. Now that normally wouldn't be a massive problem. If I go back up here though, you can see the lots of different islands. That's going to affect more places. Excuse me. You also have Tacloban being destroyed, most of it anyway. 6190, 6,190 people died, 29,000 people injured, 4.1 homeless, 14.1 million people were affected overall, costing $12 billion US. Then you had the crops being damaged, as you can see down here, and farmers losing their land. This does not only mean the farmers lose money, but also a country that needs it loses its food supply. So you can see through here, I mean, pause at your own discretion, but this is that explained in more detail. But these are the basic ones that you need to know in terms of primary effects. Okay, pause there for a second. Now, in terms of a primary effect, That is something which happens as a direct result of the hazard. So earthquake, typhoon, whatever it may be. So as a direct result of the typhoon, these things I've listed up here happened. The airport was destroyed, for example. Now, what happens if you scroll down a little bit is you come to the secondary effects. Now, as a result, the secondary effects are things that happen as a result of the primary effects. So, for example, as we can see here, you have infection and diseases spread because of the contaminated water. Also, the primary effect was the food shortage occurring because the farmer's land was being destroyed. But a secondary impact of that was that survivors had to fight for food supplies. And 8 people died from a stampede of food supplies as a result of this. Because electric was cut off for some time, it was months in some areas. These are longer term effects here. Secondary effects happen in the longer term, normally 6 months or later after the event. Education was disrupted as many schools were destroyed. The building being destroyed is the primary effect. The school impacting on education is the secondary effect. There's also more to read through here in your own time, but an oil tanker ran aground, massive oil leak in longer term. Rice prices had risen by nearly 12%. Now this bit here is quite important. I'll circle that one here. You can categorize the effects sometimes, not just in when they happen, i.e. primary and secondary, but also what they mean. So are they social effects? Are they economic effects? Are they environmental effects? So a social effect is something that impacts on people. Okay? For example, people died. That's going to affect people and their families. An economic effect is one that is about money. An environmental effect is one that obviously affects the environment. Now, these can overlap. For example, jobs being lost can affect the economy and people. But you had some environmental impacts too. For example, like as we can see here, landslides, contamination from the oil leak, for example. Now, the bit to note just here, a little space down here, is the responses. Now, you can also categorize responses. It's a lot easier, this one. Responses can either be immediate responses or longer term responses or secondary responses. Now, immediate responses are the things the government do in the minutes, hours, and days after a tropical storm or an earthquake, in this case, a typhoon. It's the things you do immediately. So an immediate response is something like saving lives. It's evacuation. It's about the priority. For example, you can't, in terms of responses, you can't rebuild the whole city in a few hours. It's impossible. Countries haven't got the resources for it. However, people are starving to death. You can't afford to wait 6 months for that either. So clean water, clean accommodation, evacuation are priorities, and therefore they're immediate responses. So the government issued a televised warning to people to prepare to evacuate. So this thing right here, this you can start to kind of evaluate yourselves. This would have been easier in a HIC. In an NIC, so an NEE, LICNEE, this would have been a little bit more difficult because not everybody has, television systems or radio systems. However, there were 800,000 people who were evacuated from this televised warning, so it did work. Read through that in your own time again. People did die though, because it was flooded the stadium where they had to evacuate to, the stadium in the big city. The government provided essential equipment and medical supplies. A curfew was introduced 2 days after the typhoon because people were stealing. So looting is a secondary impact in it as well, because people were so desperate they resorted to stealing things. That's what looting means, to steal things. They had 1,200 evacuation centres set up to help the homeless. 3 days after the storm, the main airport was reopened. Emergency aid started to arrive. 1 million food packs, 250,000 litres of water were distributed, so sent out to people within 2 weeks. These things here, these are all primary responses, immediate responses, because you can't afford to wait for water and food. That has to happen immediately. Otherwise, people are going to die of dehydration and starvation. You also had lots of aid from other countries, and that came normally to about 88.87 million in terms of promised help from third-party charities, things like that. Now, the key bits here, just to finish off with, are the longer-term responses. So these are the things that the governments do in the 6 months or even years after an event or a hazardous event. For example, this typhoon. Now, what you'll normally find is that a poorer country does things slower. I know we compared earthquakes before, but if you compared this to, for example, Hurricane Katrina, I mean, there's many factors that make it bad, including physical attributes. But ultimately, a richer country can respond better usually because it has more money to do so. So in the longer term, there's still things that they did. A cash for work program paid people to clear the debris. So basically, people who lost their jobs were paid by the government to clear the debris. Like this means kind of bits of house and bits of road and bits of infrastructure, bits of metal that just lay around, and rebuild the city. Also, the international charity organisation Oxfam, you may have seen a shop at them in England, they replaced fishing boats so people could get back to fishing. This gives the country more food. And build back better. This was a slogan from the government. It was the government's response to the typhoon. It launched in 2014, a few months afterwards, and it intended to upgrade the damaged buildings to protect them from future disasters. They have also set up a no-build zone. This basically means that you can't build houses in certain areas where they may be more vulnerable to things like storm surges. Speaking of storm surges, they've also built a new storm surge warning system and also replanted mangroves. This basically means plants that can absorb some of that water, and that will limit the dangers of storm surges. So that is a little bit of context. There's enough here to write a 9 marker on. You have the longer term responses, the immediate responses, the secondary and primary effects, as well as some of the case study stuff here in terms of context and a diagram. Now, in terms of questions you may get on this, obviously it's worth practicing some 9 markers that have come up in the past on tropical storms like Typhoon Haiyan. You may get a question about compare the responses, immediate and longer term. You may get a question that focuses on the effects, like secondary and primary effects. You may get a question that asks you to evaluate how successful the responses were. So for that, you could use any of these we've gone through in terms of build back better, things like that. Right down here, look. And you could say about how some went well and how maybe some didn't. Maybe you could bring in the looting here in terms of how responding didn't go so well. You may get a question on why the effects were so bad. So you can mention, like I said earlier on, it was Category 5 hurricane. It was at 4:40 in the morning. It was, as you can see here, the Philippines is a series of islands, therefore they're more vulnerable. And that's basically it, guys. So that is a case study. Now, I've said a lot. It's a longer video, this one. So please feel free to go back, pause it, make additional flashcards. Honestly, you can make about 15, 20 flashcards for this. Some on effects, some on responses, some on some context. But if you can start to memorize it, start repeating it in your head, start repeating it to yourself. If you can memorize, a good number of these effects and responses and a little bit about the context, then that sets you up very nicely for any 9 marker that may come up on this. Don't forget, a 9 marker could come up on your typhoon or come up on an earthquake case study as well. Like, it's most likely going to be one of those two. So you have to be prepared for it to be the typhoon if it is a typhoon. So there you go. Again, any questions, please put in the comments for me. Again, rewatch this in your own time. Please share it to anyone in your class that hasn't got this yet. because I think this one could be very useful, especially for people who missed the lesson on Typhoon Haiyan or simply don't remember it. Until then, it's been an honour, guys. I'll see you for the next one, where we're doing some practice of some question answering. Take care, guys.